maybe some people will still join us. So, good morning to this second of the roundtables within the energy and the environment theme. And I'm glad to see the two co-leads here, Greg Wilson and Lachlan McKinnon. Um, we are joining you here today from Calgary. It's 8 a.m. in the morning. So, if some of us just still seem to be sitting in the dark, that is part of the reason. We are all based here in Calgary, and we acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation within Alberta, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. As part of the deindustrialization and the environment theme on Depot, we wanted to talk about the kind of research which has been carried out by the Energy and Society Working Group at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, which is a partner organization of the project. And as you will notice, three of us are also very closely connected to the Depot project. My name, if you don't know me, is Petra Delata, and I'm one of the co-founders and past conveners of Energy in Society. I'm also one of the investigators in Depot, and I co-chair the Artist in Residence Initiative, which just published their call for applications, so please check it out on our website and spread the word. I've come to the project of Depot, or Deindustrialization, the Politics of Our Time, as an energy historian, when I was kindly invited by Stephen High and others to join. And much of what you will hear today is really related either to energy or to Alberta. And I hope in the next minute or two, I'll just sort of make a little bit more sense of why that is. When I joined Depot, I had to learn a lot about deindustrialization studies, which was an entirely new field to me. But the more I did, the more I really realized the connections to my own research, which focuses on energy transitions in the past, especially the example of West Germany and coal mining. So, first of all, many of the deindustrialization studies were actually about closing coal mines. And so I started asking myself if there was a link between deindustrialization and energy transitions. Because, of course, the closing of coal mines was often related to what we call a single fuel energy transition from coal to oil. And if so, what that link would be and how it would be relevant or useful for the project. So one of the ways that I feel energy historians can contribute to this is by focusing not on industries and labor relations, but more broadly on energy systems as social, cultural, economic, and political systems, which entail communities. It thus recenters the debate away from labor history to an environmental history. And so while we are not necessarily strictly always talking about deindustrialization and the environment, what we do in terms of our energy research is really embedded in approaches that may be informed by environmental history. And the one way that looking at it as energy systems really helps us bring in other actors is that you move away from industries as simply constituting workplaces, but really extended to meaning living places. Or you look at, energy scapes, for example, that entail everyone, including the housewife who is married to a coal miner, but who's providing reproductive labor to keep this going. And equally, it's everyone who's involved in raising issues about pollution that are related to the industry, even though it also employs their husbands. So that's one way. The other way is, of course, to sort of understand with regards to the coming energy transition, that using an energy history approach really sort of brings to the fore a much more nuanced but also normative discussion. Because if we all want an energy transition towards renewable, should we be worried about deindustrialization? And some people say no, right? That's a good thing if we move away from coal and oil. So already we see how, coming from that perspective, you may have a different normative approach and something that we will maybe see as well. The third aspect is that if energy is a foundational industry, it often informs national projects. And so, one of the aspects we need to focus much more on is things like political economy in a larger context. And that is something that we will also hear about today from some of our presenters. And lastly, two more points. One is um, Alberta might not sound like the place to study deindustrialization, but we figure that discussing a potential energy transition and potential deindustrialization is something that connects the historical study of deindustrialization to something that is very present at the moment. And so this is why you will hear some presentations that really talk about, what are the challenges to these potential types of transitions. And the final aspect that we also have some presentation on is, what is then the connection between an energy transition towards renewable, deindustrialization, but also reindustrialization, and in the wake of reindustrialization, extractivist practices. So this is kind of, to give you an overview what you're going to hear today. We have six presenters. Unfortunately, one presenter, Katie Anderson, had to pull out. I will introduce them individually, and everyone will have around 7 to 8 minutes to present. Please put any questions that you have in the chat, and then we should also have enough time for question and answers. As you will have noticed as you joined, this is currently recorded. The recording is only for the presentations, and the Q&A will not be recorded. So please don't feel that you cannot ask any questions. And as I said, a lot of it is about Alberta, and I can imagine in today's time and that there might be some questions that you have for us as well. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for joining the Energy and Society group, who is talking about deindustrialization and the environment in very, very broad terms. And we will start with someone who you may be all familiar with, who is, of course, a member of DEPO, and that's William Gillis, who is a recent MA graduate and recipient of the 2022 Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time Master's Fellowship at Concordia University, where he studied with Stephen High. He grew up on Cape Breton Island as a deindustrialized and moved to Calgary to find work, holding jobs in cartography and later political organizing. William is a founding member, researcher, and writer for the award-winning Alberta Advantage podcast. Definitely check it out if you don't know it yet, which produces episodes on current political events and working class history. He recently returned and completed his undergraduate degree in history at the University of Calgary. We're very happy about this because he can join us every Friday in our Energy and Society working group meetings. And William's primary historical research interests are labor, regional economic development, fossil fuel capitalism, and state industrial policy. The floor is yours, William.
Hello. Yeah, so my presentation to start is going to be actually hit on a lot of themes that Petra mentioned. I'm just going to share it here. And While I'm here in Calgary, I don't study Alberta. I look at Cape Breton Island, which is on the other side of the country, and it's part of the province of Nova Scotia. So what we're looking at here is this uh, this example of, I think, really talks about energy transition. So we're going to talk about what's something called the Cape Breton Development Corporation. In 1967, the federal government nationalizes most of the coal mines in Nova Scotia to prevent the economic collapse of the region. It creates the Cape Breton Development Corporation, better known as DevCo, to manage the closure. So it's actually intended to close these and then develop an economic alternative. However, after an initial wind down period, DevCo actually begins to dig new coal mines and it expands coal production through the 1970s and 80s before it finally closes in 2001, which I think the reason this happens has a lot to do with energy. So very quickly, this Cape coal problem, which was the name of a commission that investigated it in the 1960s, um, the industry had been in crisis basically since the end of World War II. The federal government, however, rejected nationalization, which was demanded by the miners in 1946. Um, but the federal government does continue to intervene in the industry, primarily through subsidies. As you can see in this chart here, the government subsidies keep increasing. However, by 1965, it's in such a serious crisis that the federal government is willing to step in, and they create DevCo for the purposes of closure. Um, Interestingly, from the primary source basis that I've read, so federal policy up until nationalization, so the 20 years after World War II until nationalization, they start charting coal as a fuel being phased out by oil, and largely the Canadian government sees this as an inevitability. Um, and at best, that the state's role here is to soften social impacts rather than truly trying to change it. However, when they do take over, the government agrees with essentially the local popular opinion that closure should not happen. So, and also this coal is still an important energy source for the local economy, primarily used in steel making and electricity. So the government, after that commission report, agrees to not do a 15-year hard schedule phase out, but instead makes it indefinite with uh, the idea that equivalent local employment had to be developed through alternative uh, programs before they would close a mine. And crucially, they dig one new coal mine at Lingan in order to sort of rationalize the industry, which was full of these older mines, because they figured it would take, 20 or so years to do the phase out. However, the 1973 energy crisis intervenes. If you look at this chart of DevCo's coal production from 1967 to 1980, 1973 is the bottom year. Uh, and then coal production begins to climb again. So besides that local opposition that pushed the government to not close the mines and actually slow down the closure, the 1973 oil crisis basically leads the government to reevaluate coal as an energy source, and in fact, actually just simply reverse course entirely on closure. Uh, and so part of this is because the alternate economic development that DevCo was also responsible for didn't really deliver as fast as they were hoping, while the coal mining industry still employed thousands of people. Um, Also, the Atlantic region of Canada was dependent on expensive imported oil because it wasn't coming from Western Canada. It was coming mostly from overseas. And in particular, this oil was used for electricity generation. So when the cost of oil went up after 1973, the cost of fuel for electricity generation in many cases just quadrupled in Nova Scotia. However, the province and the federal government responds to this by saying we can use DevCo coal to build electrical generating stations or to fuel new electrical generating stations. So by 1976, a new coal power station is built actually on the top of that first new mine at Lingan. And as I mentioned before, that these new mines were initially to rationalize the coal division for wind down, to make it essentially like lose less money. Uh, but then as soon as coal, but then these new mines become justified on the fact that actually coal is a viable domestic energy source again. So here's some examples of the federal government's internal thinking. So the Department of Regional Economic Expansion, or DRE, states that DevCo is vital to the long-range planning of energy production in Nova Scotia and will allow as rapid as possible conversion from oil to coal in energy production. And then the is it Energy Resources Development Department? Federal encouragement has energetically pursued an off-oil program with respect to power generation. So you're actually seeing the federal government trying to transition Nova Scotia's uh, power generation away from oil and onto coal. So you can see here, that's the Lingan Power Station, the photo taken by me a couple of years ago. Still there, still burning coal, built in the 1970s and 80s. It's the largest power station in Nova Scotia. So DevCo then really fits into federal and provincial policy in the 70s and 80s as a sort of secure energy producer. And of course, the result of this is that building these coal power stations really lengthens the postponing of pit closure. So these energy needs are seen as complementary to DevCo's other goals, which is primarily regional development. However, coal prices and energy prices globally begin to fall from the mid-1980s, and DevCo was never profitable. It was never intended to be profitable, but this becomes a bigger and bigger concern in the 1980s because the federal government is seeking to privatize DevCo, and from about 1990, they start shrinking the workforce and closing some of the older coal mines. Also, importantly, the provincial power utility was privatized in 1992, and as the biggest customer of Devco coal, it switched to actually buying cheaper foreign coal to improve its profitability. Also, the government in general is less concerned about sort of having an activist energy sovereignty policy, especially with coal. Uh, and however, the attempts to find a buyer for Devco and its privatization are unsuccessful, so it closes entirely in 2001. So in brief, in my very brief presentation, I think a lot of deindustrialization should be considered in terms of energy transitions. Of course, it's not always the primary explanation. I think this is obvious with respect to coal mining, but there's also an entire industrial complex that was connected to coal, and this was impacted by the shift to oil. And of course, this will have impacts as we shift away from oil to something else. Anyway, thank you, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations.
Thank you, William, for this presentation. And as you see, even though this might be, the kind of a known history of deindustrialization, the more detailed history really shows how managed deindustrialization is then sort of there to also respond to something that is a critical juncture in sort of 1970s history, which is the oil crisis. And so that's kind of one of the ways that we want to revisit this connection between energy transition and deindustrialization. A different way of doing this is now presented by Dr. Anna Bettini, who's an anthropologist, is talking more about the present. So Anna Bettini is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of History at the University of Calgary. She's also part of DEPO. She's an environmental and energy anthropologist whose research explores energy justice, contested landscapes, technological impacts, and the lived experiences of communities navigating environmental changes. Her field research spans from New Zealand to Western Canada and more recently Italy. She's the principal investigator of the Shirk Insight Development Grant project called Farming the Sun, which investigates how rural communities in Alberta and Tuscany, Italy, respond to solar developments and agrivoltaics, a system that combined farming with solar panels. Thank you, Anna. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Petra. I'm trying to share. Let's see. Um, let's see. Always, always do this. Sorry. I don't know why it doesn't allow me to share now. Oh, I'm in some trouble. Let's see. Okay.
Are you getting an error or is it
No, it's just my computer.
okay.
I always have issues with my computer. That's why my headphones didn't work. Okay, I should be able now.
We can see it, Anna.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'll be moving from Cape Breton to here, Alberta. Like Petra said, I'm an anthropologist, so I look more at um, what I say as like I define as the industrialization, like in the making, like in the way that is really happening right now. So I'm going to give a brief overview about Alberta. So, for generations, Alberta identity has been tied, as many of you know, to fossil fuels, to coal, then oil and gas, and the tar sands. Operations that have shaped a lot of towns, the economies, but also imaginations, like these ideas of progress, of stability, of work, also ideas of around masculinity, of a good, what is like a good life, a good future. And uh, by 2024, we saw that the last major coal plant, for example, switched to natural gas. So that's a signal that there's been like a change, like happening, a transition. And today, Alberta is going through a very, I would say, from my experience, very slow energy transition in some ways, very fast in others. There's been expansions of natural gas, but there's also been, in the last decade, and at least until very recently, a boom in renewable development, the renewable energy projects, especially solar and wind projects. However, the old infrastructures, like the physical, but also political, and I would say also emotional infrastructures, like persist. You have to think that now the electricity we have here, like the capacity now includes uh, 23,000 megawatts, and there is a significant portion that wind and solar contribute to. But there's also been a lot of issues with the type of energy systems because recent winters have exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities that comes with relying on renewable energy. So we can say that transitions, they're rarely smooth, and they're more complex. And one thing that allowed this rapid renewable growth was, of course, the deregulated electricity system in Alberta. Between 2018 to 2023, there were a lot of projects built, especially in central and southern Alberta. And the expansion brought a lot of tension, however. A lot of rural land use conflicts have intensified, a lot of issues with farmers, concerns toward the wildlife, but also concerns on how the landscape has been changing, because these are infrastructure that are very visible compared to oil and gas that are more invisible infrastructures for some. And as you can see, like in the picture on the left, they this project can be extended for hectares. This is an example is in Vulcan County, the Traverse Solar Farm, which is the largest solar farm in North America, with 1.3 million solar panels, and it has transformed in some ways the way people relate to the land in the area. And the same with the Buffalo Plain wind project, still like in the Vulcan County area, which I think it's like 32 wind turbines. So there's been a lot of this type of project visible and a lot of foreign investment as well that has raised a lot of questions of control, of accountability, of the like long-term ecological obligations that these companies might have. And it seems to many of those I spoke in the area that the transitions kind of reproduce older power structures, even if, as this project claim, to transform the energy system. And so, from my experience on the ground, listening to community members, but also to workers, to farmers, to municipalities, a lot of people see like sort of like patterns repeating. They perceive renewables. They're afraid of things like we've seen, like with the oil and gas, abandoned wells will happen also with this type of infrastructure. So for some, however, renewable energy provides some sort of stability because a lot of farmers they can lease their land. But for others, it becomes sort of an echo of intrusive extractive histories because they don't trust the fact that foreign companies will come and control the development as well. And we have to remember that these tensions, they unfold in a very politicized regulatory environment. In August 2023, there was a 7-month moratorium that put a pause on renewable approvals and renewable development. And the issues that were cited were that were mentioned was land use, concerns on the viewscapes. But this is the very first time that the moratorium on energy infrastructures happen really. Uh, Never happened with oil and gas, but it was only applied to renewables. So as I interviewed community members, they actually noticed this unevenness of double standards. And once the moratorium was lifted in February 2024, however, it created a very uncertain landscape for an environment for companies. And so we saw a lot of applications that they fell sharply. So there are less and less. And the key issue that a lot of the participants share with me is that this type of infrastructure are very visible. So their presence makes these changes that are experiencing this transition very visible. And so it impacts a lot of the way they also their own identity as well. And we need to remember that Alberta, mostly industrialized also through energy. So that legacy shapes how people also understand industrialization or even the possibility of it. And my research tries to make sense of these tensions that are visible and not try to resolve them, but to understand how people live with them. And in this case, we can see that energy transition is about competing visions as well as trying to cling to a past, to an identity associated with the past as well. So as an anthropologist, as I said, I see Alberta undergoing this deindustrialization in real time. And while there is still the environment is a bit more uncertain, but projects are being built. So that means that there are some jobs that are created and some investments, but definitely the transition kind of signals the presence of renewables signals a decline of oil and gas, and that threatens the livelihoods and identities that people have associated with oil and gas. And so the industrialization in this case becomes not only about work, but it shapes how people experience their daily lives. And I see renewables more as symbols of both the industrialization and reindustrialization, as also Petra mentioned before, reindustrialization because we see new jobs, new infrastructure for some, despite there are a lot of wage disparities compared to jobs in renewable versus job in oil and gas. And then for others, it signal, of course, the industrialization because they see the world is moving away from, or it's moving from oil and gas to other forms of energy. And so it threatens the identity, the livelihood, and for others also the sense of place because the land changes. And especially for community members and farmers, this represents a bit of a mix of uncertainty and fear as well. So to conclude, Alberta's transition, I see as an anthropologist as just more than energy. And so listening to people's stories about their work, the decline, the experience, the environmental changes that they see can reveal that it's not just about how energy is produced, but also how it's governed, managed, and how the provincial federal government can help communities navigate these shifts in their livelihoods and also in the way they share their space with these infrastructures.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Anna. Thank you very much. And thank you for talking us through what it looks like if we have deindustrialization in the making. We also see, of course, a story of state championing certain industries over others, something that we've already noticed in William's piece and we'll hear as well. And I appreciate the addition of viewscapes because I think if we do extend to sort of energy scapes, then there are many different scapes as well that are important to us, including, for example, labor scapes or anything else. So thank you for that. We will now move on to an economist, Lilia Garcia Manrique. She's a postdoctoral associate at the Department of Earth, Energy, and Environment. She's interested in all efforts to decarbonize the economy. Her central research is electricity markets and analysis of how they can be more clean, energy efficient. Lilia is part of the Net Zero Electricity Research Initiative at the University of Calgary. She has researched the imbalances of electricity trade between the US and Mexico, and now she's exploring the adoption of electric vehicles in Alberta. Lilia has also started research looking at the past of Calgarian firms, energy firms, and how female presence in them has shaped today's fossil fuel industry. And she'll talk to us a little bit about that research.
Thank you so much, Petra, for the nice introduction. So I'm very lucky to present after Anna because, as Anna was saying, like part of how Alberta is transitioning to a clean energy matrix is partly because of this deindustrialization. So I'm going back some years in the when it starts to be sorry, when it starts to be the oil boom in Alberta. So that it starts in 1947 with the discovery of the Leduc oil field. And that's when like Calgary starts as an oil capital. And as following the steps of many other oil capitals around the US, Calgary found the Secondary Club. This is a woman-only club, and the initiative started in New Orleans in 1949, and this club aggregates areas of Canada, the U.S. Geographically. So, like in this case, Calgary was part of like the area that was covered by Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Denver, for example. And the objective of this club mainly was to provide professional the development for women employed or affiliated with the petroleum, energy, and allied industries. They were very strict in that regard. We can tell from the documents that I have been analyzing if the boss of the one of these women reported as non being affiliated to any energy or oil related industries, this woman could lose their membership. And there was like very well organized group of people. They were like had a president, vice president, and so on. And the industry benefit a lot from these women efforts because they were traveling around North America mainly, and for any convention that this group organized, there were other firms participants. So if you were working for, let's say, Imperial Oil, there was maybe there Shell, and you will be these people, these women will be interacting with each other. So by the time they come back to their home cities, they will come back as with new network that their bosses will be exploiting. And just to give an idea, how did it look? So from 1978 to 1983, we can see a clear trend that there are more administrative positions that these women were working on. When they started, it was a highly secretarial activity, the oil industry, as it required a lot of paperwork to figure out the boundaries of where to extract oil. So then as the years move on, we can see that they are moving to a more administrative, higher ranked positions. But this membership also follow the the oil cycle, right? So if like they were like a decrease in oil prices, we can also track it from the number of memberships. So these numbers that I'm presenting to you are from the archive, but as I've been working with this data, I can now show you like from the whole period that the most of these membership were taking part. So that was 1950s to 2000s. And we can see precisely that the peak of the oil industry, that is 1980s, we can see it's the peak of the memberships recorded in their documents. Again, this is part of what Anna was telling us, right? So we reach the peak of the oil, and then we see the decrease. And very interesting, many of these women, particularly those that are after the 1980s, some of them they report exiting the club because, well, there were several reasons, one of which was to go for further education. So some of them report going back to high school, or some of them report going to technical schools, or even universities. So we are in the point where this highly extractive industry gave the tools, or in this case, the financial tools for this woman to later move on to a more highly specialized activities. And now, unfortunately, I tried to track how it looked like those that were married or not. It's not very clearly classified throughout the documents, but you can tell like most of them they were married. And most of them, they were traveling also with their husbands. So some of them, they may as well have left the group because their husbands were like reallocated to other countries. So again, like these were women that started to be highly specialized in the oil sector, and also they had a lot of experience maybe in other countries as they were traveling. This was maybe not the first time they were reallocated because they were following their husbands. So the main point and the main takeaway of what I'm presenting here is that compared to other countries, for example, from where I come from Mexico, where many of the oil-related extractive industries, they present an opportunity for a transition to get high-paid, low-skill activities. In this case, in Calgary, we're seeing how this transition worked the other way around. So a high-paid, low-skill, what starts a low-skill industry, paid enough these women, especially in the 1950s, to move them further to a more highly specialized or more administrative activities. So just to finalize my point here, let me show you how women in the 1950s within the geology sector looked like. They were highly sexualized, like they were like this pimples woman. So, and it's very interesting to see how this very feminized role then move to a more highly specialized or more technical a kind of area or work related. So that's it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Lilia, for this presentation. And I should also mention, Lilia was working with an incredibly rich archival collection, and I see we have the archivist on the call as well, Kim Giraldi. So if you work on oil, we have the Imperial Oil Collection, which is an incredible source to look into. And the reason why we are also fascinated by Lilia's work is it made us rethink, some of the normative assumptions about deindustrialization, because what we see here as well is that, it may have a negative impact even on a group like women who use the oil industry to amass funds or financial means to then actually move up in terms of their training and jobs and all this. So it's really complicating that story that we tell ourselves when we look at energy and deindustrialization. I'm very pleased to now move on to our next speaker, who's Jennifer McDougall. She's a creative writer and a PhD student at the University of Calgary. Her in-progress novel and stories, told through the eyes of female oil and gas professionals, examines the impact of Western Canada's energy sector on local identity and articulates the complex relationship women have with male-dominated industries and social institutions. And so you already see, of course, that also is something that a piece that might help us revisit the assumptions that we have, whether deindustrialization is a good or bad thing or what it does to a community. So thank you, Jennifer.
Excuse me. Thank you. Good morning. Just going to change that. Okay. I'm going to speak to you today about research creation. So in light of that, I'm going to begin with one of my poems, Glass Ceiling. Beneath 200 meters of dead earth, you and I move imperceptibly, nosing for sun, for moisture. Air pockets link a chain of potential, but most burst when disturbed. Shifting dirt smothers our efforts. While displaced, the thread-thin root of us consumed nutrients, strengthened our pliable stalk. We wait. We rhizomes shoot seismic, engage in multi-directional exploration, drill for nourishment, and seek friendly temperatures. But before chemicals, seeping through pit liners and pipelines, we wither. Rebar and post holes ring sour chords. Concrete footings sweat dry dust scent. Wood stablers invite foreign insects into our place. We double back and poke along another path. When I wrote Glass Ceiling, I should mention it was published in Room, which is a Canadian feminist literary magazine, early last year. When I wrote this poem, I approached it not just as a creative writing project, but as a way of thinking, of investigating through artistic practice. In research creation, creative work and scholarly inquiry happen together. They inform, challenge, and sometimes reveal things that neither could illuminate alone. For those unfamiliar with the term, this can sound abstract. So here's how the process looked in practical human terms. I began with a question rather than an argument. What does it feel like to struggle upward through systems built to contain or redirect you? Rather than answer with theory or data, I turned to metaphor, to embodied imagery. I used rhizomes, underground stems that grow unpredictably and horizontally, to explore resilience, constraint, and invisible labor. Throughout the writing, I treated the poem as a form of field work. The metaphors draw from environmental research on oil sand extraction, construction, and post-industrial landscapes, but the emotional arc comes from lived experience. The sense of pushing against pressures that are diffuse, structural, and often unseen. Writing became a method for thinking through these tensions from the inside, rather than describing them from the outside. The poem's fragmented lines, its list-like phrases, mimic how rhizomes grow, nonlinear, probing, constantly seeking points of entry or escape. This structure is not only aesthetic, it models inquiry itself. Writing allowed me to trace pathways of thought, like a root feeling its way through soil, tentative, deflected, sometimes blocked by unexpected obstacles, chemicals, rebar, concrete, or insects. Each of these materials drawn from research becomes an emotional and political agent, standing in for systems that constrain movement. In short, my process involved starting with a question that is both intellectual and effective, using poetic form as a method of investigation, not as a container for preformed ideas, letting metaphor and material research intertwine, allowing each to reshape the other, and finally, accepting the poem's growth as rhizomatic, following tangents, interruptions, and resistances as legitimate forms of knowledge. Think of it as a lab experiment where emphasis on curiosity drives exploration, and rigor ensures attentiveness to material and conceptual complexity. The poem doesn't just express findings, it generates them. It is both process and result, rooted in inquiry, but growing unpredictably. Building on this, Glass Ceiling aligns with University of Alberta scholar Natalie Lovelace's conception of research creation, which insists that practice responds to material, political, and institutional conditions, rather than occupying a protected aesthetic zone. The poem engages with these ideas through attention to the residues and consequences of deindustrialization and reindustrialization here in Alberta. Rebar, pit liners, chemical seepage, concrete footings, they are not metaphorical adornments, but epistemic actors, shaping what forms of life and knowledge are possible. This aligns closely with ecofeminist scholarship, which insists that material conditions are never neutral. They are gendered, political, and ecologically charged. By bringing these residues into poetic form, the work participates in a broader ecofeminist commitment to understanding how extractive practices reverberate through bodies, communities, and environments. Finally, the poem's rhizomatic structure reflects Deleuzian models of nonlinear, lateral, and adaptive inquiry. Fragmentation, interruption, and multidirectional probing allow the poem to enact distributed, contingent knowledge making, the ethical and political commitments central to research creation. By foregrounding tensions between growth and obstruction in post-industrial terrain, Glass Ceiling makes felt the lived consequences of economic and ecological transformation. Rather than producing a straightforward argument, the poem generates an experiential pathway into these pressures, embodying the challenges that shape collective and individual attempts to move, adapt, or persist. In this way, it functions simultaneously as creative practice and scholarly method, thinking with landscapes shaped by extraction, attentive to how those landscapes continue to condition bodies, communities, and futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And also, thank you for talking us through what could be a very different approach to understanding also that lived experience in energy landscapes. And I think that might be also pertaining to photography. I know that in our deindustrialization and environment theme, we are thinking about, using other sort of artistic expressions and ways of making sense of place, to use maybe anthropologists' words here. So thank you very much. We'll now moving on to the last two speakers, who are, as you will see, sort of focus on something slightly different. And we'll start first with Mac Penner, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at the University of Calgary and also what we call highly qualified personnel in the Canadian Carbon Dioxide Removal Research Initiative, short CANCOR. Broadly, he studies the linked histories of capitalism and liberalism in the 20th century. And presently, he's working especially closely on the history of the Canadian fossil economy and the political behavior of oil and gas companies with regards to climate change and technology. And I should also say, look forward to his book coming out, because he has been writing on the so-called Calgary School. So those of you in Canada for whom this creates all sorts of associations, Mac has written his PhD thesis on it, and we all look forward to that book coming out. So the floor is yours, Mac.
Thanks, Petra. Hopefully sooner than later on the book, but I fear later is what's going to be the actual result here. I'm just going to totally forgo any and all preamble in the interest of time and basically just jump right in here. Okay, so amid recent news of this seeming rapprochement between the Albertan and the federal governments on matters of energy policy and the possibility of this new pipeline running out to the BC coast from Alberta, I'm going to begin here by casting things back just a couple short years to 2023, when on this front, I think things looked a little bit different. So among the developments in Alberta, Ottawa, the many developments in Alberta, Ottawa relations in that year was this dust-up between Alberta Premier Daniel Smith and then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, plus, of course, several of his ministers, over the Liberal government's proposal for what they were calling a just transition. So there, in a letter that she sent to Trudeau in January of 2023, Smith wrote, quote, "To once again raise Alberta's serious concerns with the proposed federal just transition legislation," end quote. So here, just as Smith had done in countless forums previously, in the letter, she argued that the call for a just transition was, in effect, a call for the demise of the national fossil fuel industry, which, of course, was most concentrated in Alberta. So it would be ill-advised, she counseled the Prime Minister, to signal the end of a vibrant, thriving industry. But Smith's letter was not simply of the "you say fossil industry bad, we say fossil industry good" sort. And instead, Smith's pitch was that the idea of a just transition was erroneous, in large part because it basically made a foe out of a friend. So far from an obstacle to a more sustainable sort of energy regime, the fossil fuel industry was, in this view, and in fact, the key to such a regime. So signaling the end of the industry, which of course nobody was actually doing, was misguided because the industry had, quote, "the ability to reduce Canada's and the world's emissions through technological innovation and increased exports of liquid natural gas and other clean burning fuels the world so desperately needs," end quote. So Smith's view, then as now, was that both economic and environmental sustainability would be best delivered by a flourishing fossil fuel industry. So she accordingly called for this just transition legislation to be replaced with what she called sustainable jobs legislation that would both bolster employment in the conventional energy sector and also incentivize investment in spin-off industries devoted to the development of emissions-reducing technologies. So here, I think surely there are kind of many ways into a more historical discussion of this more or less contemporary episode. But I'm going to go from here and put things like this. If you fed and watered me adequately and you gave me a pair of scissors, I'm pretty sure that I could manage to reproduce an equivalent of Smith's letter just by cutting out excerpts. I'm sorry, Kim, this probably sounds horrifying, but just by cutting out excerpts from manuscript material in the archives of the Imperial Oil Company, going back several decades now. So that's to say that that Smith's pitch in her letter to Trudeau was almost precisely the same sort of pitch that Imperial and presumably other firms with less accessible archives have been making now for decades. So for our purposes here, then I want to zoom in on one rhyme in particular. So near the end of her letter to Trudeau, Smith, I think, shifted into this sort of curiously utopian register. Quote, Prime Minister, we can and must work together. Operating in political silos as adversaries on this issue is getting us nowhere, and I believe all Canadians are tired of seeing it. Canada should be the world's greatest energy superpower. It can be if we come together collaboratively in pursuit of that objective. There is no limit to our nation's potential. End quote. So in this world in which Canada is a global energy superpower, Canada is also, in this view, a kind of domestic political paradise where we all work together on account of our shared interests in realizing this immense energy potential. So this, to me, sounds very much like an address of J.A. Armstrong, Imperial's chairman and CEO, at the firm's annual general meeting on the 21st of April, 1981, an address that featured in something I published recently with Niche and that I submitted to critique by my colleagues here at Energy and Society. So, of course, here it's worth saying that the moment, such as it was 45 years ago, was totally different than the contemporary one, but I think I can kind of bring this together here. So, assessing Canada as a country in which general morale was dwindling, in 81, Armstrong suggested that a flourishing energy industry was like a panacea for existing national problems. Quote, there is scarcely a sector of the economy that does not stand to gain substantially from a program of resource development on the scale required to meet our energy needs, he claimed. But Armstrong went even further into much the same utopian territory that we saw Smith in more recently. So a robust and profitable energy industry was not just the solution to economic problems here, but, quote, the ripples that emanate from a country hard at work in an important cause extend far beyond the economic sphere. They penetrate every corner of our society, end quote. And so then here, Armstrong's ripples would then serve in, quoting again, replacing despair by hope, cynicism by optimism, and renewing a nation's sense of purpose. So he concluded that a country that is pulling together to achieve a common goal does not have much time or inclination to worry about pulling apart, sounding much like Smith did decades later. So I think that maybe this utopianism should seem kind of surprising, or does seem kind of surprising. I think we might be more inclined to expect a kind of pragmatism here, right? Claims that, yeah, well, we get it. There are concerns about the environment or social concerns or whatever. But the fact is, in this imagined pragmatism, that the fossil fuel industry is integral to our economy, and to disrupt that would be to engage in like a needless act of self-sabotage. So that's, at least from my perspective, what I might kind of expect here. But instead, we get this real grandiosity, both an implication that so much of what we have is a product of the fossil economy, but also that we could actually have so much more, right? Superpower status, national harmony. If only we could just come together on these points. Okay, so let's see if I can land the plane here. I don't know if I can. From the perspective of present debates about a just transition, I wonder if this evidently long-standing utopianism isn't an important element of, like, let's call it the Smithian reaction in contemporary context. So I think part of what we're seeing here is like a clash of these actively conjured utopian and dystopian visions. So utopia first, the fossil fuel industry leading us into the harmonious future by continuing to produce the fuels on which the world runs, and simultaneously leading the development of technologies that will basically clean up that process as it rolls along. On the other hand, dystopia, a just transition that effectively dismantles, or as it were, deindustrializes the fossil economy and leaves us in the aftermath collectively all but rudderless. So, of course, no one was actually making the dystopian case, but I think it is easy enough and useful enough for these fossil utopians to present the opposing side as basically dystopic. Okay, so trying to conclude here, as I suspect I'm running out of time. I'm going to leave off with this. Let's see how this goes. If the fossil political imaginary is a utopian one that will see any and all moves against it as if they were effectively dystopian, I think the transitional imaginary, if I can call it that, would be well served by a utopianism of its own. So, of course, I don't have time here to speculate about details, but suffice to say, I think you'll probably agree with me that climate policy is too readily seen and too often presented only as a form of sacrifice and coping, right? So here what I would say, if I can modify a phrase and try not to laugh, who in their right mind would bring a mitigation strategy to a utopia fight? And if appropriately armed, who wouldn't like their chances in a utopia fight with Danielle Smith? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mick. And I wonder whether, question to everyone, whether the deindustrialization narrative is that helping a utopian or dystopian narrative here, right? But I also appreciate that you remind us that the politics of deindustrialization is more than the politics of closure. And I think there is a lot more in it that we can still sort of look at, especially in connection with energy. So we have one more presenter, so bear with us, and we are very, very happy to move now to the Global South and or our presentation on the Global South. And I welcome Ana Alicia Watson Jimenez, who's a postdoctoral associate at the Political Science Department here at the University of Calgary, and who holds a PhD in geography from the University of Calgary. Her expertise in political ecology and participatory environmental governance is grounded in her extensive experience as a biodiversity specialist, a transdisciplinary researcher, and her passion for environmental justice. Through her research, Anna aims to uncover the underlying conditions and power dynamics that promote inclusive and participatory environmental governance. Her goal is to bridge the gap between transdisciplinary knowledge production and decision-making in order to facilitate effective and equitable science policy.
Thank you, Petra. Thanks to everyone to stay here. So bear with me. I will try to be as concise as I can. This presentation is actually part of my recent publication that is in GeoForum, and it has the same title. It's about discussing the idea of disconnection in terms of natural gas extraction. So I'm glad that I came after the Alberta case presented by Mac, because this is exactly what it is. It's like when you combine the ideas of environmentalism and oil and gas extraction in a way that the industry can be suggested as clean or sustainable. So I'm from Peru, and in Peru, we have our energy matrix mainly based on hydroelectric power. But then around the 90s, we started to create the conditions to develop natural gas extraction from the Amazon. And in doing that, because we didn't have enough demand, because we are not an industrialized country, we used that natural gas extraction mainly for exportation. We export gas to Mexico, to Europe, to Japan. And as you see in this map, we are one of the great spots in Latin America that actually sells gas beyond pipelines, fixed constructions. It goes through maritime routes to other places in the world that requires the energy to keep producing and sustain their livelihoods. And this extraction, or fossil fuel extraction, has been framed as sustainable because it comes from the idea that it will help the country to overcome poverty. It also comes from the idea that the extraction can be sustainable done in the Amazon. And it also comes from the idea that the natural gas can be a green energy that will help to transition to more renewable energies to other countries because it's more clean than other fossil fuels when it burns. this is a close-up of what is happening actually in the Amazon. When you have this huge international narrative that is framed the same area as an area that could help the country to support development, that could help the world transition to a better energy system, but at the same time that could be protected because it deserves to be protected as a biodiversity hotspot. So we have a long-standing disconnection of perception of disconnection from the Amazon to the rest of the country that requires that the rest of the country should protect but exploit at the same time. We have an expansion or a growing expansion of hydrocarbon exploration, but also an expansion of natural protected areas that takes the lands from the indigenous communities to put on the nation building project, and also to support carbon mitigation and biodiversity conservation for the whole planet. So what is interesting about Camisea is that in the 90s, when Shell discovered that natural gas reserves, they were thinking how they can present this extraction as something acceptable for other parts of the world, demonstrating that it could be possibly done as extraction with a low environmental footprint. Well, the idea was to actually develop a roadless design. Everything that comes from Camisea, it is not connected by road. It's air transportation or river transportation. So they call it offshore inland because they try to replicate what is happening on offshore platforms in the Amazon. And with this idea, they will keep the area pristine and disconnected. So it is possible to support natural protected areas. It is possible to protect communities that actually lives inside to do not be touched by the modernity and the ideas that pollute the Amazon. But what does actually remoteness work for these communities when the gas extraction is flowing from their territories towards other parts of the planet, but they don't have energy, they don't have banks, they don't have access to the national state power, they don't have any services, and they are kept remote in terms of everybody's protecting them. So how these environmentalisms actually support or not the indigenous claims and indigenous rights in these areas. Well, to try to think about that is first, don't take the idea of remoteness as something given. It is not the characteristic of the place. It is actually a manufacturing and outcome of social practices. You keep area remote because of something. And this symbolic, but also material lack of connectivity sometimes also emphasize the rhetorical distance between two types of citizens in the same country, because it also is sometimes connected with colonial ideas of these areas that needs to be conquered and dominated and then assimilated partially in a way. And it also, it's a handful of selective actions that sometimes states can use to regulate individuals and create those differences that galvanized colonial legacies. So in trying to zoom in, and I know I have a lot of maps, but it's because I'm geographer, so I'm sorry. You can see that there's one water gap that actually is the end of the road. It seems like a barrier, and it traditionally for indigenous communities that was called a tonkini, or it was a sacred place that protects them from the outsiders. This sacred place is now more like a past of different materials flows outside of the communities. For them, it is not easy to cross that. It is expensive, and it is also a justification in some case for national governments to say they don't have logistics to get into those places, to, for example, have a proper monitoring systems to evaluate pollution. They don't have a proper system to access to give them services. So it is actually the question that how remoteness has been a barrier to what? Because it does not stop the flows of natural gas from outside, but for whom? A barrier for whom to access the benefits of the extraction, to access the services and the needs as it should be accessed if they want to. So after a discourse analysis, and I spent it almost 4 months with indigenous communities, learning from them, I was able to track the many forms that the remoteness narrative has actually affected those communities for the last 30 years. It has been an authorized practice that elevates the extractive development in those areas as sustainable, but at the same time, it has eliminated autonomy of these areas. But this resistance has not been silenced. For every time the remoteness has tried to present the people out of there disconnected from the government, they also has been organized to try to change that narrative. Like, for example, they will always try to be presented only as craftsmen on the lower sides of the supply chain for the extraction. On the other side, they were trying to present themselves as entrepreneurs and somebody who does not oppose the extraction, but is trying to gain access to those opportunities that sometimes the governments and private industries present for the extraction. They were trying to be portrayed as environmental leaders, despite of their environmental knowledge, it is not considered. And this dynamic contestation has been also traced in the evolving complexity of the territory. We have different processes of territorial fragmentation that was also tried to fragmenting the collective action of all of these people, but they are there resistant and always being creative in reproducing multiple types of resistance in their discourses, in their identity, and also in the way that sustainability should be conceptualized. As a final remark, I wanted to say that a selective remoteness presents something that is so far away that it could be protected, at the same time extractive, but at the same time overcome poverty. It has been a paradox for the local communities. They don't want to be seen as the victims of the extraction, but they feel they are the victim of the extraction. And it has not been easily to change that because of the lack of resources, the lack of support, but also the lack of access. And I want to finish because I think I'm on over the time, but I want just to finish by acknowledging and thanking and giving my thanks to the communities where I spent a lot of my ethnographic work with them, opened their hearts, opened their houses, and shared all of these perceptions that sometimes are really difficult to grasp when you have to travel 1 week to reach them, because that's the way to get into those places, despite of being the energy hubs in Peru. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you everyone who presented, and also thanks to those who stayed on. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I hope you saw as well how our conceptualizing of deindustrialization is something having to do with energy transition, and then expanding it by using a more environmental approach, which really talks about landscapes, which talks about those bodies and people who are inhabiting those landscapes, gives us a very different and maybe useful and at least generative approach to deindustrialization. So the floor is open. I think we start.